Hi folks, I wanted to do a little video today to take a look at this sketchbook here. This is the very first sketchbook I have ever painted on every single page and completed entirely. I am not really a big fan of sketchbooks. That's not really part of my artistic practice usually. I struggled to use this one. I have been really reluctant to spend a lot of money on them, and it's really hard to find a good watercolor sketchbook that's a reasonable price. I have a beautiful one that was handmade by someone I follow on Instagram, but it was not cheap, and so I find myself reluctant to use it because I don't want to quote unquote waste it. So this one is actually one of the very first sketchbooks I ever have because I made it myself. I bought some cheap B 100% cotton paper, chopped it up into pieces, or rather tore it into pieces. You can see on the edge here it's kind of rough because I tore some of it and had some of it cut once it would fit in the paper cutter. And then I took some old scrapbooking paper I had and made this cover for it, these cover pieces, and then I used some embroidery thread and used a stab binding technique to make my own sketchbook. So it's the same print on the front and the back. It has a different inside, which I liked a lot. I would actually not recommend doing this. Learn from my mistake. This stab binding technique was the easiest and most simple one that I found when I was looking into this, and it was not a great choice. I put too many pieces of paper into this book. I believe it has 30 sheets, which if you use the front and the back like I do, that's 60 pages total you can use. And the stab binding was just not a good choice for that much. It doesn't stay open in the middle, which we'll see as we go through it, and it's kind of a little misshapen now from trying to fold it. If I had had better tools at the time, maybe I could have used like a bone folder to fold the pages, but I didn't. And so it's fine and it was adequate for my needs at the time, but it is not something that I would do again. But anyway, I wanted to kind of go through with this book and just look at what I've done with it. So in my terrible handwriting, this is my sketchbook for swatches and notes. I started it in October of 2018 and I just finished it this month. I think it was earlier this week, maybe. This is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, so what is it, the 23rd, November 24th. So it took me a long time to fill this up. And I started off painting on just the right side of the page, and then I came back through the book and painted on the other side. So the first few things I did were some primary triads of different colors, and now I have some other paintings on the back sides of the pages of combinations I like with my palette knife technique that I use now. That is something that developed over the last couple years, so just some different things that I have in here. Skipped a page there. A lot of color combinations that I liked that I didn't want to forget what they were. I was doing some experimentation with the 4 seasons, trying to find some palettes to do, some color palettes to do some palette knife paintings with them. So those are some of the colors I settled on there. What else have we in here? Another palette. This was one of the first pages that I made to try and remember some combinations that I really liked as I was just getting started. Complementary colors have always been a big favorite of mine. They make great neutrals most of the time. Trying out some sponges, some different techniques. I neglected to label which sponge I used on each one, and then I couldn't remember after I was done, so that's why that one's a little unhelpful as a reference. Some messes that I made trying out weird techniques, some new techniques. This one I believe was a comparison of trying wet on wet. So on this one on the left here, I let each layer dry, like the lightest leaves, and then went in with the medium and let it dry, and then did the dark, so they're more distinct shapes. And on this right side, I went in while the colors were still wet and added the darker tones, so you have more of a blending effect with that one. I don't know which one I like better. I like them both, really. This was my idea for a giant collage I did. Well, giant for me, 11 or 10 by 14, I think it was. And this was a thing I did for a while where I bought a ton of paints, and so they were often, I had duplicates of the same pigment color, which is this here, this pigment red 209, which is a quinacridone red or coral, depending on which brand you buy it in. So since it's the PR 209, that is the exact same pigment, and it's in different brands, and so it's just interesting to try them, since I had them anyway, to see the differences. So even though this is the exact same pigment, they do look totally different. I prefer the Daniel Smith Coral on the far left there. The M. Graham has a bit more granulation, and then Winsor & Newton is more similar in color to the M. Graham. So that's always been wild to me, that you can have the exact same pigment and it looks totally different, and sometimes behaves totally different too, depending on the manufacturer. It might possibly have something to do with the binders they use. Maybe they use different quantities. Some more palette knife colors. So here is PV19 in the 3 brands I own: American Journey, M. Graham again, and Winsor & Newton. Again, a huge variation in range there. Those colors all look totally different from each other. I like Winsor & Newton Rose in that one. Palette knife experiments, more color experiments. Like I said, I painted on this page a lot, or first through most of the book, and then went back later on and painted on this left side here. So this was painted probably back in 2018, and this is recent. This a month or so ago probably. So this is PV19. I love magenta. It's a fun color. Random swatches, some mistakes when I was comparing PV29 Ultramarine, a great color, a blue that I love. Some experiments, trying a technique. This is actually from trying some of the techniques in maybe the Tao of Watercolor, I think. I got some tiny brushes and tried them out, different mark making. I don't ever use these brushes. They're too small for me. I hate tiny detailed work with a violent passion. Neutral mixes that I like. So like I said, complementary colors make the best neutrals. You can use a little more of one color or another to lean it to the warm edge of the spectrum or the cool edge, so that's fun. That's what I was trying out here. These French Ultramarine, such a lovely granulating quality. Some failed experiments with using plants to stamp and make marks. Trying to make roses, loose roses, more successful on this side, I think. Lots of experiments just so that I could have a reference, although who knows if I'll remember to look back in here when I need these things. So here's where I got into using both sides of the page more often, and here's where you can see I'm kind of struggling to hold the book open. That's what I was saying about this was just too thick for this stab binding technique in my personal opinion. I am also not a professional bookbinder, and this is literally the only bookbinding I have ever done, so if I did it wrong, that would also not surprise me one jot. Color combinations I like. Again, more palette knife stuff back here that I was been doing more of over the last year. Primary triads again for a card class that I made and that I do sometimes in person. This is my preferred palette for that, with the modern triad. So it uses a bright peacock blue, it's more of a CMY kind of palette, a cyan, a magenta, and a yellow. I don't usually use black in my watercolor much. And the very last page, which is nice. That one's kind of pretty all on its own. And then that was the back of that paper. So that is a tour through my very first sketchbook, both the very first one I ever used and made myself, and also the very first sketchbook I've ever finished.